Imagine completely redesigning like a multi-million-dollar fighter jet, right? You make it incredibly eco-friendly. But then once it's up in the air, the pilot realizes the battery just randomly shuts off right in the middle of a high-speed dogfight.
Oh, man. Yeah, that sounds like an absolute nightmare.
It really is. And well, welcome to the deep dive. That nightmare scenario is essentially what Formula One is dealing with right now.
Exactly.
Today, we're looking at a massive stack of sources. We've got the official FIA 2026 technical regulations, technical analysis from engineers like Marco Corricelli, statements from the F1 Commission, paddock intelligence reports, and, team press releases.
It's a lot of paper.
Yeah, it's a huge stack. But our mission today is to unpack this incredibly high-stakes emergency summit that's happening on April 9th.
Right. And it really is an emergency in, like, every sense of the word. We're looking at a scenario where these radical 2026 rule changes they've accidentally engineered what people in the paddock are calling a safety time bomb.
A safety time bomb. Wow. So we're going to explore why this happened, the intense frustration the drivers are having over energy management, and we'll debate the 6 proposed fixes on the table before the Miami Grand Prix on May 3rd.
Yeah, because Miami is approaching fast and they got to get this sorted out.
For sure. But to really understand why the FIA and all the team bosses are locking themselves in a room to fix this, we have to talk about Suzuka. Lap 21 of the Japanese Grand Prix. That was the real catalyst here.
It was. I mean, Haas driver Oliver Bearman suffered a massive 50G crash at 308 kilometers per hour.
50 Gs. That's just...
It's wild. To put 50 Gs into perspective for you listening, that is 50 times the force of gravity. So imagine a full-grown elephant just suddenly sitting on your chest for a fraction of a second.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it is an incredibly violent physical trauma to the human body.
Thankfully, he walked away with just bruised knees. But looking at the telemetry and the reports we have, Bearman didn't just lose control of the car on his own, right?
No, not at all. He was forced to swerve to avoid Franco Colapinto's Alpine. Colapinto was traveling roughly 50 kilometers per hour slower on a section of the track that is supposed to be completely flat out.
Right, and as a viewer, I'm watching this thinking, shouldn't a world-class driver just naturally steer around a slower car? Like, why is this specific 50-kilometer-per-hour speed delta so much more dangerous than, the normal overtakes we see every weekend?
It's a fair question. The danger lies entirely in the element of surprise. Like, in a normal racing situation, a driver visually judges the closing speed of the car ahead.
Sure.
If a car is defending or taking a different line, you anticipate it. But Colapinto didn't have a mechanical failure, and he wasn't braking for a corner. This sudden deceleration was a direct feature of the new 2026 engine regulations.
Ah, okay. The famous 2026 regs.
Right. Specifically, that shift to a roughly 50-50 power split between the internal combustion engine and the electrical power.
The 50-50 split the whole motorsport world has been debating. But wait, F1 has the most advanced simulation facilities on the planet. I mean, they run billions of data points. How did the smartest engineers in the world fail to foresee cars effectively brake-checking each other on the longest straights?
Well, the crazy thing is they actually did foresee it.
Right.
Yeah, the simulations predicted this a year and a half ago, but, predicting a data point and safely managing it on a live track with 20 cars, those are 2 very different things.
Right. I guess chaos is hard to simulate perfectly.
Exactly. So to achieve that 50-50 power split, the rule makers massively increased the power output of the MGU-K. That's the kinetic motor generator unit. They bumped it from 120 kilowatts to a staggering 350 kilowatts.
Wow.
Yeah, that is nearly 470 horsepower coming entirely from the electric motor. But crucially, to simplify the engines, they completely removed the MGU-H.
Okay, so the MGU-H, if I remember right, that was the unit that passively recovered electrical energy from the extreme heat of the exhaust.
That's the one.
So without it, the car isn't constantly trickle-charging the battery in the background anymore. So how are they keeping these massive new batteries charged?
They have to rely entirely on that supersized MGU-K. And we really need to explain how the MGU-K physically works.
Okay, lay it on me.
It's connected directly to the rear axle. When it deploys energy, it spins the rear wheels faster. Simple enough, right?
Yeah.
But when it needs to harvest energy, it acts like a massive generator. It magnetically resists the rotation of the rear axle, literally physically dragging the rear wheels to claw back power into the battery.
Okay, so it's essentially a mechanical anchor.
Yes,
It
exactly.
makes me think of, like, riding an electric bicycle. It's like pedaling an e-bike at top speed down a huge hill, and suddenly the motor violently reverses to act as a massive brake so it can recharge the battery. You'd fly right over the handlebars.
That is the perfect mechanical analogy, honestly. The mechanism of harvesting energy creates a violent drag on the car. So Colapinto's car essentially switched from deploying 350 kilowatts of forward thrust to suddenly dragging the rear axle to harvest energy.
And Bearman was caught completely off guard.
Right, because he was directly behind him in the slipstream.
Yeah.
He was fully expecting both cars to continue accelerating toward the braking zone.
Man. And the paddock has coined a specific term for this phenomenon, haven't they? Super
Oh,
clipping.
yeah, super clipping. It occurs when the car's software either suddenly depletes its available battery charge or forcefully commands extreme energy recovery right in the middle of a straight. The power delivery just completely falls off a cliff.
We actually have a brilliant quote in our sources from engineer Marco Corcelli who breaks this down.
Oh, yeah, read that one.
He says super clipping is like being on a highway at 90 kilometers per hour and suddenly someone stops right in front of you.
Which is exactly what happened at Suzuka. And, the ripple effects of this engine formula go way beyond just the race on Sunday. It has completely altered the DNA of Saturday qualifying, too.
And the drivers are absolutely furious about it.
Oh, they hate it. Because qualifying has historically been the pinnacle of a driver's raw speed, right? You're pushing the car to the absolute physical limit for one perfect, uncompromised lap.
Yeah, just all-out driving.
But the 2026 regulations enforce a strict 9 megajoule energy recovery limit per lap. Because the MGU-K burns through energy so aggressively at that new 350 kilowatt output, drivers can no longer drive flat out.
Looking at the sources, the driver reactions are pretty scathing.
Yeah.
Max Verstappen called the 2026 cars Formula E on steroids.
Right.
And said the required driving style is essentially anti-driving.
That's a brutal assessment from a world champion.
Yeah, and Lando Norris flat out stated that they went from driving the best cars in the world in 2025 to the worst in 2026.
And mechanically, you can totally see their frustration. To meet that 9 megajoule recovery target, they're being forced into a technique called lift and coast.
Right.
So even on their fastest, all-out push laps in Q3, they have to take their foot off the gas pedal well before the actual braking zone. They coast down the straight, letting the MGU-K drag the car to harvest energy just to ensure the battery doesn't completely die before they cross the finish line.
So they're sitting in these incredible engineering marvels,
Yeah.
but they're constantly holding back. It sounds like having a state-of-the-art smartphone that runs blazing fast, but the battery dies by 2 p.m.
Oh,
So
totally.
you have to constantly dim the screen and turn off apps just to make it to the end of the day,
Yes. You're staring at energy target numbers on the steering wheel dash instead of actually looking at the apex of the corner.
which is awful. But if everyone from the world champions to the midfield drivers hates this power delivery and it's causing terrifying 50G crashes, the obvious question is, why not just tear up the rulebook? Why not walk into that April 9th summit and say, hey, we made a mistake. Let's go back to 70% combustion engine and 30% electric.
Because the sport has effectively locked itself in a financial and political prison.
Money and politics. Always.
Always. Let's look at the financial handcuffs first. Formula One operates under strict cost caps now. For 2026, the power unit manufacturers are restricted to a separate $130 million budget limit.
Right. Which is a lot of money, but goes fast in F1.
Exactly. These hybrid engines aren't just CAD drawings anymore. The research and development money is largely spent. The engines have been physically built, they've been validated on the test benches, and they are currently racing on the track.
So a late reinterpretation of the rules, or a mid-season shift back to relying mostly on combustion power, isn't just an engineering challenge.
No, it would force manufacturers to completely redesign and rebuild the physical power unit. That would instantly breach that $130 million cost cap.
Wow. So F1 essentially built a multi-billion-dollar trapdoor. They created this 50-50 split to attract new manufacturers, but now they can't escape it to fix safety issues without someone getting sued or breaching the cap.
That's the political trap, yeah. F1 specifically designed this 50-50 electrical split as bait. They wanted to prove the sport was relevant to modern, sustainable road car technology.
Which makes sense on paper.
And that bait worked flawlessly, It lured automotive giants like Audi and Ford into joining the sport for 2026.
Okay, so if the FIA suddenly caves to the drivers and diminishes the electrical component, they risk completely alienating these multi-billion-dollar corporate partners. partners.
Exactly. You can't just look at the board of directors at Ford or Audi and tell them the hybrid architecture they just spent hundreds of millions of dollars developing is suddenly being scrapped for safety reasons.
Yeah, it would be a very uncomfortable Zoom call.
Very. And this financial strain is even more severe at the back of the grid. The situation with Alpine and Franco Colapinto is actually a fascinating case study in how rigid these rules are.
Oh yeah. After some early season struggles, this massive narrative exploded on social media that Alpine was intentionally sabotaging Colapinto's car to favor his teammate, Pierre Gasly.
Yeah, people went crazy.
It got so toxic that Alpine actually had to release an 11-page open letter to the public.
And that letter laid bare the brutal reality of the cost cap era. It wasn't sabotage or some internal conspiracy. Alpine had to transition to a highly complex new Mercedes gearbox and a completely redesigned cooling architecture for the 2026 chassis.
Right.
To contextualize this for you, machining a single new carbon fiber and titanium gearbox case can eat up hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So under the strict financial regulations, midfield teams like Alpine or Haas are operating right at the razor's edge of their budgets.
Right. They simply do not have the manufacturing bandwidth to physically produce upgrade parts fast enough to put them on both cars at the same time.
So one driver gets the upgrade, the other has to wait a few races, and the fans misinterpret the resulting pace deficit as sabotage. And we should be clear with you, the listener, we aren't validating or defending the team dynamics here, but we are highlighting how our sources show this as a core symptom of the larger system.
Yeah, the system is stretched thin. If the FIA forced a massive hardware redesign right now to fix the super clipping issue, the top teams like Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, they could probably absorb it.
Because they have this sprawling infrastructure and simulation capacities?
Right. But the smaller teams would be utterly decimated. They can barely afford to manufacture the parts they already have.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of the April 9th emergency summit. The physical hardware is locked, the budgets are pretty much spent, the corporate partners breathing down their necks.
Yep.
But they absolutely must fix the cars before the Miami Grand Prix on May 3rd. Because right now, sending these cars out on a high-speed street circuit with concrete walls is just begging for another 50G impact.
It really is. So the discussion in that room has to shift from what they want to do to what they can practically achieve.
Okay, so let's get into the solutions. Our paddock intelligence sources indicate that the debate will center around 6 specific proposals, right?
Yes. And these generally fall into 3 distinct categories: tweaking the power software, altering the aerodynamics, and changing the qualifying rules.
Let's start with the power software, because that directly addresses the brutal deceleration we saw. The first proposal is to increase the superclipping power threshold, essentially equalizing the energy harvesting rate at 350 kilowatts.
Right. The logic here is symmetry. If the car deploys at 350 kilowatts and harvests at 350 kilowatts, you create a more predictable energy cycle.
Makes sense mathematically.
Mathematically, yes. The problem is, while it might balance the system, a sudden 350 kilowatt harvesting drag is still incredibly violent. It doesn't eliminate the speed differential that actually caused the Suzuka crash.
Okay, so that leads to the second power proposal.
Yeah.
Reduce the maximum deployment limit. So instead of letting the MGU-K dump 350 kilowatts of power instantly, they dial that maximum limit way back.
Exactly. By deploying less electrical power at any given moment, the available energy stored in the battery lasts much longer down the entire length of the straight. The car won't suddenly run out of juice and hit that super clipping wall.
Wait, if we intentionally cut the maximum power output just to save battery life, aren't we purposefully slowing down the absolute pinnacle of motorsport?
Yeah, pretty much.
That feels like buying a hypercar and permanently leaving it in valet mode.
It is a profoundly painful compromise, but you're spot on. It would undoubtedly make the car slower overall. There are genuine fears that heavily restricting the deployment could drop the lap times uncomfortably close to the Junior Formula 2 series.
Yikes. That is a tough pill for the marketing department to swallow.
Yeah.
F1 cars being challenged by F2 cars.
You are trading ultimate headline-grabbing pace for predictable safety.
Okay, so what about a software fix that doesn't completely neuter the top speed? That brings us to the third proposal. Changing the MGU-K ramp down profile.
Now, this is perhaps the most elegant technical solution on the table. Rather than the electrical power cutting off abruptly like stepping off a cliff, the software algorithms would be rewritten to implement a gradual drain curve.
Oh, I see.
So as the battery depletes toward the end of the straight, the power gently tapers off. The physical drag is introduced smoothly over several seconds, allowing the trailing driver to visually anticipate the deceleration and react safely.
Okay, that sounds way better. So that handles the race day safety hazard. But what about the drivers complaining that the cars are miserable to drive on Saturday?
That opens up the next category of proposals, fixing qualifying. Proposal 4 is to cut the energy recovery limits.
Right. Currently, the drivers are forced to recover 9 megajoules of energy per lap in qualifying. The proposal on the table is to drop that required limit down to 6 megajoules, or perhaps the 8 megajoule limit they briefly tested during free practice at Suzuka.
And lowering that recovery target means the drivers don't have to lift and coast as aggressively. They don't have to drag the car as much, meaning they can actually keep their foot planted on the throttle for a longer portion of the lap.
So it gives them back a fraction of that all-out purity that qualifying is supposed to represent.
Exactly. And tying right into that is proposal number 5, simplifying the rulebook algorithms. The current software dictates complex hitter thresholds that trigger severe power cuts the moment a driver's foot slightly lifts off the throttle pedal.
So simplifying those trigger points would make the power delivery feel more organic, right? More connected to the driver's actual inputs, rather than feeling like the driver is constantly fighting a stubborn computer program overriding their decisions.
Spot on. And finally, we have the most creative proposal on the table. If slowing the cars down with engine limits is too politically unpopular, we can look at aerodynamics.
Okay. Proposal 6 involves expanding the active aero zones.
Right. The 2026 cars feature these highly advanced movable wings. Currently, there are incredibly strict zones on the track where drivers are permitted to use the low drag configuration, which the paddock calls X mode.
When X mode is activated, the wing flaps open up, shedding massive amounts of air resistance. And the proposal is to completely remove these zone restrictions during qualifying, allowing teams unrestricted freedom to use X mode wherever they want.
Yeah,
So we are basically using an aerodynamic trick to solve an electrical battery problem.
precisely. If the car has significantly less aerodynamic drag pushing against it, the internal combustion engine doesn't have to work as hard to punch a hole through the air.
Well, that's clever.
The car naturally glides faster,
Mhm.
which inadvertently saves precious battery life down the straights. It reduces the reliance on aggressive electrical deployment.
All right, so we've laid all the pieces on the board. We know the constraints. We have a hard deadline of May 3rd for Miami. The top teams can simulate any change, but the smaller midfield teams will collapse if the financial burden is too high. But we also know the FIA holds the ultimate trump card. They can force regulatory changes through immediately, regardless of whether the teams agree, by citing safety grounds.
And they will absolutely use Oliver Bearman's 50G crash as their leverage to do that.
Totally. So, as our technical analyst, what is the verdict here? When the doors unlock on April 9th, what actually happens?
Well, the verdict really comes down to practicality versus idealism. Any physical hardware changes to the power units or the chassis are completely off the table.
Right, because of the $130 million cost cap.
Exactly. It makes it impossible. The manufacturers will veto it, and the smaller teams simply can't afford it. Therefore, the consensus must strictly revolve around software tweaks.
Because implementing a software update doesn't require a massive budget or a 6-week carbon fiber bake cycle and a high-pressure industrial autoclave. Changing lines of code is virtually free compared to machining new physical parts.
Bingo. So the data really points toward a dual solution. I expect the FIA and the teams to agree on implementing that MGU-K ramp-down profile, smoothing out that sudden power cliff into a gradual curve to prevent another Suzuka incident.
Okay.
And crucially, I expect them to open up those unrestricted active aero zones for qualifying.
It makes perfect logical sense. It balances the rigid financial handcuffs of the cost cap with the urgent, non-negotiable need to protect the drivers.
Yeah.
It fixes the software, not the hardware. It smooths out the power delivery, addresses the severe safety concerns, and it gives the drivers a bit of their raw pace back on Saturdays, all without bankrupting the midfield teams who are already stretched to the limit.
It is the ultimate Band-Aid. And it buys the sport crucial time to figure out the much larger existential questions regarding this 50-50 power split for 2027 and beyond.
So, to wrap this massive investigation up for you, Formula One is currently sitting on a knife's edge. A revolutionary push toward sustainable road relevance with a 50-50 hybrid power split has accidentally engineered a severe safety crisis, punctuated by a violent 50G impact. Rigid financial caps and multi-billion-dollar corporate partnerships prevent them from simply building new mechanical parts to fix the flaw. The entire immediate future of the sport hinges on an emergency summit on April 9th, where they must find consensus on software and aerodynamic tweaks before the grid hits the concrete walls of Miami.
It really is a fascinating real-time masterclass in how rigid financial frameworks and political ambitions eventually collide with the brutal laws of physics and human safety. You are basically watching a multi-billion-dollar sport trying to rebuild its airplane while it is already in a nosedive.
Which brings us right back to our fighter jet with the eco battery.
It sure does.
It leaves us with a final provocative thought to ponder. If Formula One now relies so heavily on complex energy recovery algorithms, battery harvesting profiles, and automated Active Aero just to keep the cars safely on the track,
Yeah.
at what point does the car's software become the actual competitor and the world-class racing driver merely a passenger managing a spreadsheet?
Oof. That is a question that might just define the next decade of motorsport.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.